I stood alone in the VIP section of the Orpheum Theater, surrounded by couples swaying to the orchestra's rendition of Rachmaninoff, and felt the weight of my solitude like a physical thing pressing against my chest. The ticket had cost me 3 months of savings from my adjunct professor salary, a gift I'd bought for Marcus and myself to celebrate our 5-year anniversary, back when I still believed in permanence and promises whispered in the dark. He'd texted me 2 hours before the concert, a coward's breakup delivered in blue light. I can't do this anymore. I've been seeing someone else. Someone who wants the same things I want. The implication was clear. I was the problem, with my books and my small apartment and my refusal to abandon my doctorate for his corporate dinner parties. So I came anyway, alone, because the ticket was non-refundable and because some part of me refused to let him take this from me too. I wore the black dress I'd bought for tonight, silk that whispered against my thighs, and I stood in the section reserved for the city's elite, pretending I belonged here, pretending my heart wasn't a shattered thing barely holding itself together with spite and stubbornness. The music swelled around me, violins weeping something that sounded like my own grief translated into sound, and I closed my eyes against the sting of tears I refused to shed in public. "You're alone." The voice came from behind me, low and dark as smoke, wrapped in an accent I couldn't quite place. Italian maybe, softened by years in America, but still present in the way he shaped his consonants. I turned, and the breath caught in my throat not because he was handsome, though he was, but because everything about him radiated danger in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The people around us had shifted, I noticed, creating a bubble of space, as though his presence demanded distance, respect, fear. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a suit that probably cost more than my car, with dark hair styled back from a face that was all sharp angles and harder edges. But it was his eyes that held me, dark, calculating, ancient despite the fact that he couldn't have been more than 35, holding depths that suggested he'd seen things that would break most people. "I am," I said, lifting my chin in a gesture of defiance I didn't quite feel, because something in his gaze made me want to run, to hide, to protect whatever innocence I had left from whatever darkness lived in him. By choice. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but I'd be damned if I'd let a stranger see my humiliation, my heartbreak, my pathetic attendance at a concert meant for two. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, more acknowledgement of my deception. "Then you won't mind helping me with a small problem." He moved closer, and I caught his scent, expensive cologne layered over something darker, whiskey and gunpowder and danger, a combination that should have repelled me, but instead made my pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a hunger I hadn't known I possessed. "You see those men by the east entrance? Don't look now, just trust me that they're there. They're watching me, waiting for me to be alone, vulnerable. But a man with a woman, a man clearly devoted to someone, that's a different target altogether." I should have said no. Every instinct of self-preservation I possessed screamed at me to walk away, to find safety in the crowd, to remove myself from whatever situation I was being pulled into. But there was something in his eyes, a challenge mixed with a strange vulnerability, as though he was offering me a choice he rarely gave anyone. "What exactly are you asking?" I kept my voice steady despite the way my heart hammered against my ribs. "Pretend you're my woman," he said, and his hand came up to cup my face, thumb brushing my cheekbone with a gentleness that contradicted everything else about him. His touch was warm, calloused, the hand of someone who'd built his empire with violence as much as intelligence. "Kiss me like you mean it, like I'm the only man in this room who matters. Sell it, and I'll make it worth your while." He pulled a business card from his pocket, pressed it into my palm. "Whatever you need, whatever you want, it's yours. One kiss, one performance, and you have my protection and my gratitude." I looked at the card, heavy cardstock, embossed with a name that made my blood run cold. Dante Moretti, CEO, Moretti Imports. I'd read about the Morettis in the newspaper, carefully worded articles that danced around accusations of organized crime, money laundering, connections to the Italian Mafia. The kind of family that owned half the city's politicians and all of its secrets. And here was their prince, their heir, asking me to kiss him in a theater full of witnesses. One kiss, I heard myself say, and watched something flash in his eyes. Surprise maybe, or respect for my courage, or perhaps just satisfaction at getting what he wanted. I didn't wait for him to move first. I stepped into his space, rose up on my toes and my heels, and pulled his face down to mine with hands that trembled only slightly. "Then make it convincing," I whispered against his mouth. He kissed me like a man drowning, like I was air and salvation and everything he'd been searching for in the darkness of his existence. His hand fisted in my hair, the other arm banding around my waist to pull me flush against the hard planes of his body. And I forgot about Marcus, forgot about my broken heart, forgot about everything except the way this stranger's mouth moved against mine with a desperation that felt genuine despite the performance we were selling. He tasted like expensive scotch and something darker, something forbidden, and when his tongue swept against mine I heard myself make a sound that should have embarrassed me, but instead seemed to inflame him further. The kiss deepened, went from performance to something real, something hungry and desperate and dangerous, until I forgot we were in public, forgot we were strangers, forgot everything except the way he made me feel, wanted, desired, protected, claimed. When he finally pulled back, we were both breathing hard, and his eyes held a heat that had nothing to do with the act we'd just performed. "What's your name?" His voice was rougher now, affected in a way that suggested the kiss had impacted him as much as it had me. "Aria," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Aria Sinclair." "Aria." He said my name like a prayer, like a promise, like a threat. "The men are leaving. You played your part perfectly." But he didn't release me, didn't step back, and I realized with a start that I didn't want him to. Something had shifted in that kiss, some fundamental change in the air between us, as though we'd signed a contract in blood and breath without meaning to. "Have dinner with me tomorrow night. Let me thank you properly." I should have said no. Should have taken his card, thrown it away, and returned to my safe, small life with my books and my heartbreak and my carefully constructed walls. Instead, I found myself nodding, found myself giving him my number, found myself watching as he disappeared into the crowd with his security detail materializing around him like shadows given form. I touched my lips, still swollen from his kiss, and wondered what I'd just agreed to, what door I'd just opened, what darkness I'd just invited into my life. The rest of the concert passed in a blur, the music washing over me without penetrating the fog of confusion and desire that had settled over my thoughts. I kept touching the business card in my clutch, feeling the raised letters of his name under my fingertips, proof that it had been real, that I hadn't hallucinated the entire encounter. When I finally made it home to my studio apartment in the Arts District, small and shabby compared to the obvious wealth Dante Moretti commanded, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and tried to recognize the woman staring back at me. My lips were still swollen, my carefully applied makeup smudged, my eyes holding a wildness I'd never seen before. I looked like someone who'd been thoroughly kissed, thoroughly claimed, and the sight sent a shiver of something dangerous through my body. My phone buzzed at exactly 7 the next morning, an unknown number that I somehow knew belonged to him. "A car will collect you at 7 tonight. We're something beautiful." The presumption should have angered me, the assumption that I'd be available, that I'd agree to his plans without discussion or negotiation. Instead, I found myself opening my closet, pushing past the practical clothes of an academic, searching for something that would match the woman I'd seen in the mirror last night, the woman who'd kissed a stranger in public, the woman who'd felt alive for the first time in months. I spent the day trying to focus on grading papers, on the dissertation chapter that was already 2 weeks overdue, but my mind kept returning to the feel of Dante's mouth on mine, the way his body had felt against me, hard and unyielding and radiating a heat that had nothing to do with temperature. I researched him during my lunch break, falling down an internet rabbit hole of carefully curated information and wild speculation. Dante Moretti, 34, took over Moretti Imports after his father's death 5 years ago. The company officially dealt in high-end Italian goods, wine, olive oil, designer furniture. But the whispers suggested it was a front for something much darker. Money laundering, arms dealing, protection rackets that controlled half the city's businesses. He'd never been charged, never even questioned officially, because the Moretti family owned everyone who mattered. And I'd kissed him. More than that, I'd agreed to see him again, to step willingly into his world despite knowing the danger it represented. I told myself I could handle one dinner, could satisfy my curiosity about this man who'd looked at me like I was something precious, something worth protecting, something worth wanting. Then I'd return to my life, my safe existence, and forget the way his kiss had made me feel like I was finally fully alive. The car that arrived at 7 was a black SUV with tinted windows and a driver who opened my door without speaking, his eyes scanning the street with the practiced awareness of someone trained in security and violence. I slid into the leather interior wearing a deep burgundy dress I'd found at a consignment shop. something that clung to my curves and made me feel powerful despite my nervousness. We drove through the city as evening fell, past my familiar neighborhoods into areas where old money met new power, where historic brownstones stood alongside modern high-rises, until we pulled up to a building I recognized from magazine spreads. The Moretti Tower, 50 stories of glass and steel that dominated the skyline like a monument to ambition and ruthlessness. The driver escorted me through a private entrance, into an elevator that required a key card and retinal scan, security measures that seemed excessive until I remembered exactly who and what Dante Moretti was. We rose in silence, floor numbers flashing past until we reached the penthouse, and when the doors opened I stepped into a space that took my breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the entire city, lights spreading out below like fallen stars, while the interior was all clean lines and expensive taste. Leather and dark wood and art that probably cost more than I'd earn in my lifetime. It was beautiful and cold, a space designed to impress rather than comfort, and I wondered what it said about the man who lived here. You came. Dante emerged from what I assumed was the kitchen, carrying 2 glasses of wine, and I had to remind myself to breathe. He'd changed from the suit he'd worn at the concert, now dressed in dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with scars that suggested his hands had known violence. He looked more dangerous like this, less polished, more real, and I felt that same pull I'd experienced at the concert, that magnetic draw towards something I knew could destroy me. You didn't really give me a choice, I said, accepting the wine and taking a sip to calm my nerves. It was incredible, probably older than I was, the kind of wine that appeared in auctions and private collections. The car, the time, the assumption I'd be available. That's very presumptuous of you. He smiled, and it transformed his face, made him look younger, less burdened by whatever weight he carried. I'm a man used to getting what I want, Arya. And I wanted to see you again. Wanted to thank you properly for last night. He gestured toward the dining area, where a table had been set for 2, candlelight reflecting off crystal and china. I had my chef prepare something special. I hope you're hungry. I should have been intimidated by the obvious display of wealth, by the ease with which he commanded this level of luxury, but instead I found myself intrigued by the contradictions he presented. The dangerous man serving wine with his own hands, the criminal heir lighting candles for dinner, the ruthless businessman looking at me with an expression that bordered on nervous. Who were those men at the concert? I asked as he pulled out my chair, his hand brushing the small of my back in a gesture that felt both possessive and protective. The ones you needed protection from? Dante settled into his own seat, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer, that he'd deflect or lie or shut down the question entirely. But then he leaned back, wine glass balanced in long fingers, and studied me with those dark, ancient eyes. Rivals. Men who think that with my father gone, the Moretti family is vulnerable. They've been testing our defenses, looking for weaknesses, waiting for an opportunity to strike. He said it matter-of-factly, as though discussing a business merger rather than threats to his life. But a man who appears vulnerable, who has something to protect, that's a different calculation. They won't move against me if they think hurting me means hurting someone innocent. Someone like you. The implications settled over me like ice water. So I was a shield, a human barrier between you and violence. I should have been angry, should have felt used, but there was something in his expression that suggested the truth was more complicated than that simple explanation. You were a gift, he said quietly, and the honesty in his voice made me look up, made me see past the dangerous exterior to something raw underneath. I've been alone for a long time, Arya. By choice, by necessity, because the life I lead doesn't allow for weakness, for attachment, for anyone who could be used against me. And then I saw you at the concert, standing alone in a crowd of couples, looking beautiful and broken and brave, and something in me shifted. I shouldn't have approached you. Shouldn't have pulled you into my world. But I couldn't walk away. The confession hung between us, vulnerable and dangerous, and I didn't know how to respond to it. So I did what I always did when faced with complicated emotions. I deflected. Tell me about the business. The real business, not the wine and olive oil. I watched his face carefully, looking for anger or evasion, but instead saw a flash of respect. What do you know already? He stood, moving to the kitchen to retrieve dinner. Pasta that smelled incredible, homemade from the look of it, served with a simplicity that contradicted the obvious luxury of everything else around us. I know the Morettis have been in this city for 3 generations, I said, accepting my plate and trying not to moan at the first bite, fresh pasta with a sauce that tasted like summer in Italy, simple and perfect, and probably made with ingredients that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I know your family owns legitimate businesses and several that are probably less legitimate. I know your father died 5 years ago, officially of a heart attack, though the rumors suggest otherwise. And I know that you took over an empire at 29 and have been consolidating power ever since. Dante's smile was sharp, predatory, the look of a man who appreciated intelligence in his opponents. You've done your research. What else do the rumors say about me? That you're ruthless. That you've eliminated everyone who challenged your authority. That you're more dangerous than your father ever was because you have his cunning and your own particular brand of calculated violence. I met his eyes steadily, refusing to look away despite the intensity of his gaze. That you're not a man to be crossed or trusted or loved. And yet you're here. He reached across the table, captured my hand in his, thumb stroking across my knuckles in a gesture that should have been comforting, but instead felt like a brand. Knowing all of that, understanding exactly what I am, you still came. Why? The question demanded honesty, and I found myself giving it despite every self-preservation instinct screaming at me to lie, to protect myself, to maintain distance. Because for the first time in months, I felt something. When you kissed me, when you looked at me like I mattered, like I was worth protecting and wanting, I felt alive. And I've been dead inside for so long that even the danger of you seemed preferable to the safety of my loneliness. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the carefully maintained facade, and suddenly he was standing, pulling me up from my chair, his hands framing my face with a gentleness that contradicted everything I knew about him. I'm not a good man, Arya. I've done things that would horrify you, hurt people, made choices that have cost lives. But I look at you and I want to be better. Want to protect instead of destroy. Want to build something instead of burning it all down. His voice was rough, raw with an emotion I couldn't name. Stay with me tonight. Not for sex, just stay. Let me show you that I can be more than the monster everyone believes I am. I should have said no. Should have finished dinner, thanked him politely, and returned to my safe life. Instead, I nodded and watched relief flood his features, and let him lead me to the massive leather couch overlooking the city. We talked until the early hours of the morning, trading stories like currency. My childhood as the daughter of immigrants who'd sacrificed everything for my education, his upbringing in a family where power was currency and weakness was death, my dreams of teaching and writing, his burden of responsibility for hundreds of families who depended on the Moretti organization for survival. The business isn't just crime, he told me as we shared a blanket against the air conditioning, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that felt natural despite only knowing him for 2 days. Yes, we have operations that exist in gray areas. Protection services for businesses in rough neighborhoods. Mediation for disputes the police can't or won't handle. Import channels that avoid excessive taxation. But we also employ hundreds of people legitimately. We invest in the community, fund scholarships, protect families who have nowhere else to turn. You're justifying it, I said quietly but without judgment, making it sound noble when it's still criminal. I'm explaining context, he countered, and I felt his hand stroke through my hair, an absent-minded gesture of affection that suggested he was more comfortable than he wanted to admit. The world isn't black and white, Arya. It's all shades of gray, and I've learned to navigate those shades to protect what's mine. But you're right, it's still criminal. It's still dangerous. And being close to me means accepting that darkness. I tilted my head to look up at him, studying the strong line of his jaw, the faint scar above his eyebrow, the way shadows moved across his face in the dim lighting. Why me? You could have any woman in this city. Models, socialites, women who understand your world and wouldn't ask difficult questions. Why pursue someone like me? His answer was simple, devastating in its honesty. Because you're real. Because when you looked at me at the concert, you saw past the name, the reputation, the fear everyone else shows. You saw a man, just a man, and you chose to help him without knowing what it would cost you. That kind of genuine kindness is rare in my world. Precious. Worth protecting. I fell asleep there on his couch, wrapped in his arms, and woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and the smell of coffee. Dante stood at the window, phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapid Italian in a tone that suggested the conversation was about business, the dangerous kind. He'd put on a suit, transformed from the almost vulnerable man of last night into the polished predator the city feared. And when he saw me watching, he ended the call abruptly. I have to go, he he said, crossing to me and pressing a kiss to my forehead that felt like a promise. But my driver will take you home whenever you're ready. There's breakfast in the kitchen, clothes in the guest room if you want a shower. Make yourself comfortable. He hesitated, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Uncertainty, hope, fear. Have dinner with me again tonight. And tomorrow. And every night after that until you get tired of me. That's not how dating works, I protested weakly, even as part of me thrilled at the idea of seeing him again, of stepping further into this dangerous world he'd opened up to me. I'm not interested in dating, Dante said bluntly, and his hand cupped my cheek, thumb brushing my bottom lip in a gesture that made heat pool low in my belly. I'm interested in keeping you, in making you mine, in building something real in the middle of all this darkness. Tell me you feel it too. Tell me I'm not insane for wanting this after knowing you for 2 days. I should have told him he was rushing things, that we needed to slow down, that this intensity wasn't healthy or normal or safe. Instead, I kissed him, pouring everything I couldn't say into the press of my lips against his, and felt him respond with a hunger that suggested he'd been holding himself back until now. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes held a possessive heat that should have terrified me. Tonight, I agreed, and watched satisfaction curve his mouth into something predatory and pleased. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of dinners and late-night conversations and stolen kisses that left me wanting more than he was willing to give. Dante showed remarkable restraint for a man used to taking what he wanted, always pulling back before things went too far, always leaving me aching and frustrated and desperate for more. He took me to restaurants where we were seated in private rooms, introduced me to his inner circle, his cousin Marco, who served as his consigliere and looked at me with obvious suspicion, his head of security Victor, who assessed me like a threat to be neutralized, his younger sister Gabriella, who studied me with shrewd eyes and proclaimed me interesting, in a tone that could have meant anything. I kept teaching my classes, kept working on my dissertation, but increasingly found my thoughts drifting to Dante during lectures. Found myself checking my phone for his messages. Found myself planning my days around the evenings we'd spend together. It should have concerned me, this rapid integration into his life, but instead it felt natural, inevitable, as though I'd been waiting my entire life for someone to look at me the way he did. Like I was rare and precious and worth protecting at any cost. You need to be careful, my best friend Sarah warned over coffee 3 weeks after that first meeting at the concert. She'd been my roommate during graduate school, one of the few people who knew about Marcus's betrayal, and the concern in her voice was genuine. Dante Moretti isn't just dangerous, Arya. He's the kind of dangerous that ruins lives. That kills people who get in his way. That makes people disappear when they know too much. He's not like that with me, I protested, but even as I said it I knew it was both true and a dangerous delusion. He wasn't violent with me, wasn't cruel, but I'd seen glimpses of the darkness he was capable of. The cold fury when a business rival had approached us at a restaurant. The deadly calm when one of his men had failed a task. The scars on his hands and body that spoke of violence survived and inflicted. That's what every woman thinks, Sarah said gently, and I hated the pity in her eyes. Until it's too late. Until they're in too deep to escape. Please just be careful. Don't lose yourself in him. But it was already too late for that warning. I was falling, had been falling since that first kiss, since the moment he'd looked at me like I was his salvation instead of just another woman. And when my apartment was broken into 2 days after that conversation, my belongings ransacked and a message spray-painted on my bedroom wall. Stay away from Moretti or you're next. I called him before I called the police, before I called anyone else, because some part of me already knew that he was the only one who could protect me from the consequences of being his. He arrived within 15 minutes, flanked by Victor and 3 other men I didn't recognize, all of them armed and dangerous, and moving through my small apartment with the efficiency of a military operation. Dante pulled me into his arms without speaking, his hand cradling the back of my head while I shook with delayed reaction. And I felt his heart racing against my cheek, felt the tension in every line of his body. Who did this? I asked when I could finally speak, pulling back to look up at him. The men from the concert? Probably. His voice was flat, emotionless, but his eyes held a fury that made me grateful I wasn't the target of his anger. They're escalating, trying to make me vulnerable by going after you. They think hurting you will hurt me. He paused, and something shifted in his expression. They're right. You're my weakness now, Arya. The one thing they can use against me. The admission should have frightened me, should have made me pull away, but instead I found myself pressing closer, seeking the solid warmth of him, the protection his presence offered. What do we do? You move in with me. He said it with the same matter-of-fact tone he used to discuss business, as though it was the only logical solution, the only option that made sense. Tonight. Right now. My penthouse has security that makes Fort Knox look vulnerable. You'll be safe there, protected, untouchable. And I'll find whoever did this and make sure they understand that you're off limits, that touching you means war. I should have argued, should have insisted on my independence, should have refused to let threats dictate my life choices. But standing in my violated apartment, seeing my books torn and scattered, my clothes destroyed, my safe space transformed into a crime scene, I couldn't muster the energy to fight. Okay, I said quietly, and felt his arms tighten around me, felt his lips press against my temple in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. Pack what matters to you, Dante instructed, and his men moved immediately to help, treating my belongings with surprising care as they loaded boxes and bags into waiting SUVs. Everything else I'll replace. Better quality, whatever you need, whatever you want. You're mine now, Arya. Mine to protect, mine to provide for, mine to keep safe from anything that would hurt you. The possessive language should have raised red flags, should have triggered every feminist instinct I possessed, but instead it sent a thrill through me that I couldn't deny or explain. I wanted to be his, wanted the protection and security his claim offered, wanted to surrender the burden of independence for the safety of his possession. It was probably unhealthy, definitely codependent, but in that moment I couldn't bring myself to care. Moving into Dante's penthouse changed everything between us in ways I hadn't anticipated. The guest room he'd offered became my nominal space, but I rarely used it, instead finding myself drawn to his bedroom in the late hours when sleep eluded me, finding comfort in his presence even when we did nothing but talk. He had nightmares, I discovered, dreams that left him gasping and reaching for weapons that weren't there, and I learned to wake him gently, to ground him with touch and voice until the violence in his eyes faded. My father died in my arms, he told me one night after a particularly bad dream, his voice rough in the darkness. Shot by a rival family during a meeting that was supposed to be neutral ground. He made me promise I'd protect the family, keep them strong, never show weakness. And I've kept that promise for 5 years, but it's exhausting, Arya. Exhausting to be the monster everyone needs me to be, to make impossible choices, to carry the weight of all those lives. I held him as he spoke, my fingers carding through his hair, offering comfort without judgment or platitudes. You're allowed to be tired, I murmured. Allowed to be human. Allowed to let someone else be strong for you sometimes. He turned to face me then, and the vulnerability in his eyes stole my breath. I've never had that. Never had someone who saw past the power to the person underneath. Who chose to stay even knowing what I am, what I've done. His hand came up to frame my face, and I saw the question in his eyes before he asked it. I want you, Arya. Have wanted you since that first kiss. But I need you to be sure, need you to choose this. Choose me, with your eyes open to all the darkness. My answer was to close the distance between us, to kiss him with all the pent-up desire and emotion of the past month, to show him without words that I'd already made my choice, already committed myself to this dangerous path. He responded with a hunger that suggested his restraint had been hanging by a thread, rolling me beneath him and worshipping my body with hands and mouth and whispered words in Italian that sounded like prayers. When he finally entered me, it felt like coming home, like finding a missing piece I hadn't known I was searching for, and I wrapped myself around him and let the world narrow to just this. His body moving against mine, his breath hot against my neck, his voice rough with need as he claimed me completely. Afterward, as we lay tangled together in sweat-dampened sheets, he traced idle patterns on my hip and spoke words that changed everything. I'm going to marry you. Not a question, but a statement of fact, a declaration of intent. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. I'm going to put my ring on your finger and make sure the entire city knows you're mine, that you're untouchable, that anyone who threatens you answers to me. I should have told him he was being ridiculous, that we'd only known each other a month, that marriage required more than desire and protective instincts. Instead, I kissed him again and whispered, yes, because some part of me had already accepted that this was my future, this man and his darkness and the dangerous life he lived. The attack came 2 weeks later, sudden and brutal, and proving that his world was exactly as dangerous as I'd feared. We were leaving a charity gala, one of the rare public events Dante attended to maintain his legitimate business facade, when gunfire erupted from a passing car. Victor shoved me to the ground, covering my body with his own while Dante and his other men returned fire with weapons that appeared from nowhere, and I lay there on cold pavement in my evening gown and listened to the sound of people dying, of violence I'd only ever experienced abstractly through news reports and crime statistics. When the shooting stopped and Victor finally let me up, my ears were ringing and my dress was ruined and Dante was standing over two bodies with blood on his suit and murder in his eyes. He turned to me, and I saw him assess me for injuries, saw relief flood his features when he found none, and then he was pulling me into his arms and crushing me against his chest. "You're okay," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "You're safe. I've got you." But I could feel him shaking, could hear the edge of panic in his voice, and I realized that for all his power and control, the thought of losing me had shaken him more than the actual violence. "Who were they?" I asked, pulling back enough to look at his face, to see the cold fury settling over his features like a mask. "The Russo family. They've been pushing for war for months, testing my patience, trying to provoke a response." His voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of a man making calculations about death and retribution. "This ends now. Tonight. They came after you, violated the rules that keep this city from descending into chaos. They signed their own death warrants. I should have been horrified, should have begged him not to escalate, should have run from this world of violence and revenge. Instead, I cupped his face in my hands and made him look at me, made him see past the rage to the man underneath. "Then do what you have to do. But come back to me. Promise me you'll come back." The request seemed to anchor him, to pull him back from whatever dark place he'd gone. "Always," he promised, and kissed me hard enough to bruise. "Wait for me at home. Marco will stay with you, keep you safe. I'll be back before dawn." He left me with his cousin, disappeared into the night with Victor and his soldiers, and I spent the longest hours of my life pacing the penthouse and trying not to imagine all the ways this could go wrong. Marco watched me with something like sympathy, offering coffee and bland reassurances that sounded hollow even to my own ears. "He's different with you," Marco said finally, when my pacing had worn a path in the expensive carpet. "Softer. More human. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing, but seeing how far he'll go to protect you, maybe you're what he needs. Someone worth fighting for instead of just surviving." Dante returned at 5 in the morning, blood on his hands and exhaustion in his eyes, and I met him at the door without speaking, without asking questions I didn't want answered. I led him to the bathroom, stripped off his ruined clothes, and washed the blood from his skin with gentle hands while he stood silent and still, letting me care for him in a way I suspected he'd never allowed anyone before. When he was clean, I pulled him to bed and held him while he slept the dreamless sleep of the truly exhausted, and I lay awake watching the sunrise and accepting that this was my life now, violence and tenderness, danger and devotion, a love that existed in the shadows of a world most people never saw. "The Russos are done," Dante told me the next morning over coffee, his voice matter of fact despite the gravity of what he was saying. "Their leadership is dead or in hiding, their operations dismantled, their territory absorbed by our family. The other families have been notified that you're under my protection, that any threat to you is a declaration of war. You're safe now, as safe as anyone can be in this life." "At what cost?" I asked quietly and watched his jaw tighten. "How many people died last night? How much blood is on your hands because of me?" He set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, and when he looked at me his eyes held a darkness that reminded me exactly what he was capable of. "Don't ask questions you don't want answered, Arya. The Russos made their choice when they targeted you. What happened after that was inevitable, necessary, and completely justified in my world. If you can't accept that, if you need me to be something I'm not, then we end this now before either of us gets hurt worse." The ultimatum hung between us, sharp and dangerous, and I realized this was the moment of truth. Either I accepted all of him, darkness and violence included, or I walked away and returned to my safe, small life. I thought about Marcus, about his inability to accept who I really was, about how I'd spent 5 years trying to be the woman he needed instead of the woman I was. And I thought about Dante, who'd seen every part of me, the bookish academic, the woman who'd kissed a stranger in public, the person who could hold him through nightmares and wash blood from his hands, and wanted me anyway, completely, without asking me to change. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, and watched relief flash across his features before he could hide it. "But I need you to promise me something. No more lies, no more protecting me from the truth. If I'm in this, if I'm choosing this life with you, then I need to know what that means. All of it. Dante stood, moved around the table, and pulled me from my chair into his arms. I can promise you honesty, he said against my hair. But honesty is ugly, Arya. It's knowing that I've killed men with my own hands. It's understanding that my wealth comes from activities the law considers criminal. It's accepting that there will always be threats, always be enemies, always be violence lurking at the edges of our life together. Can you live with that? I tilted my head back to meet his eyes, and the question I saw there was genuine. He truly didn't know if I'd stay, truly believed I might leave despite everything. I've lived 28 years playing it safe. I told him, following the rules, making responsible choices, building a life that looked perfect on paper, but left me feeling empty inside. And then you kissed me at a concert, and I felt alive for the first time in years. So yes, I can live with your darkness. Because the alternative is going back to existing instead of living. He kissed me then with a desperation that suggested he'd been preparing himself for rejection, for loss, for another person leaving him alone in the darkness he inhabited. And I kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring everything I felt into the press of lips and tongue, the tangle of bodies, the mutual claiming that sealed my fate as surely as any contract signed in blood. 3 days later, I received a call from Sarah that changed everything again. I need to talk to you, she said, her voice tight with stress. Not over the phone. Can you meet me at our usual coffee shop? Alone. Something in her tone made alarm bells ring in my head, but I agreed, checking with Dante first, a habit I'd developed not because he demanded it, but because his world operated on different rules, where spontaneous meetings could be traps and old friends could be compromised. He insisted Victor accompany me, staying close but giving us the illusion of privacy when Sarah arrived looking pale and frightened. I'm sorry, she said without preamble, and my blood ran cold. I'm so sorry, Arya, but they came to me 3 days ago. Men who knew things about my family, about debts my father owes, about problems that could ruin us. They said if I didn't help them get information about you, about your relationship with Dante Moretti, they'd destroy everything my parents built. The betrayal cut deeper than Marcus's ever had, because Sarah had been my constant, my safe harbor, the person I'd trusted absolutely. What did you tell them? My voice sounded distant to my own ears, calm despite the way my heart was shattering. Nothing yet, she insisted, tears streaming down her face. I wanted to warn you first, wanted to give you a chance to. I don't know, to prepare, to protect yourself. But they gave me a deadline. Tonight. Either I give them details about Dante's security, his schedule, his vulnerabilities, or they come after my family. Her hands shook around her coffee cup. I don't know what to do. I can't betray you, but I can't let them destroy my parents either. I looked at Victor, saw him already on the phone, undoubtedly reporting this conversation to Dante, and felt the weight of the choice I'd made settling onto my shoulders. Tell me everything, I said to Sarah. Who they are, what they want, what they've threatened. And then we fix this together. The next hour was a blur of explanations and phone calls, and Victor's men quietly surrounding the coffee shop, transforming it from a safe space into a fortress. Dante arrived within 30 minutes, and the look he gave Sarah was cold enough to make her flinch, the predator assessing prey, calculating threat levels and appropriate responses. The Castellano family, he said after hearing her story, and I heard the contempt in his voice. They've been trying to find leverage against me for months. Your father's debts give them that leverage, make you an easy target to flip. He turned to me, and his expression softened fractionally. This is what I meant about the ugliness of truth. Your friend is caught in a web not of her making, forced to choose between betraying you or watching her family suffer. And now I have to decide what to do about it. You help her, I said immediately, and saw surprise flash in his eyes. You pay off her father's debts, you make it clear she's under your protection, and you eliminate the Castellano family's leverage. Because that's what you do. You protect the people who matter to the people you care about. Sarah looked between us with obvious confusion, probably expecting threats or violence, not protection and assistance. Dante studied me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, and then he nodded slowly. Victor, get me the details on the Castellano operation and Sarah's father's debts. We'll handle this today. He turned to Sarah, and though his voice remained hard, I heard the thread of compassion underneath. You come to me first next time someone threatens you. Understood? Arya cares about you, which means you're under my protection whether you want it or not. But if you ever actually betray her, if you give our enemies information that puts her at risk, there won't be enough of you left to bury. The threat should have been horrifying, but Sarah just nodded, relief flooding her features, and I realized she'd been expecting much worse. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for even considering it." "You were protecting your family," I said gently, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "I understand that. But Dante's right, you come to us first now. We handle threats together." Watching Dante orchestrate the solution to Sarah's problem gave me new insight into how his organization operated. Within hours, her father's debts were paid. The men who'd threatened her were visited by Victor's team with warnings that left them pale and cooperative. And the Castellanos received a message that made it clear any further attempts to target people under Moretti protection would be met with overwhelming force. It was efficient, ruthless, and effective, and I found myself fascinated by the machinery of power he commanded so effortlessly. "You're good at this," I observed that evening as we shared dinner in the penthouse, the city lights spreading below us like captured stars. "Reading situations, finding leverage, solving problems before they become crises. You could have been anything: a legitimate businessman, a politician, a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Why stay in this world if it costs you so much?" Dante was quiet for a long moment, swirling wine in his glass, and when he finally spoke, his voice held a weariness I'd rarely heard. "Because I'm good at this too. The violence, the control, the constant vigilance required to stay alive and keep my people safe. My father raised me for this, trained me since I was old enough to understand what the family business really meant. And maybe I could have walked away, built something legitimate, but hundreds of families depend on the Moretti organization for their livelihoods. The men who work for us, their wives and children, the businesses we protect, the community we support. They need someone strong enough to hold this territory, smart enough to navigate the politics, ruthless enough to make the hard choices. I can't just abandon them because I'm tired of the weight." The responsibility he carried became more visible in moments like this. The burden of being not just a criminal but a provider, a protector, a leader for people who had nowhere else to turn. "What if we found a way out?" I asked carefully, testing the waters of a thought that had been growing in my mind. Not abandoning anyone, but transitioning the legitimate businesses to full legality, setting up trusts for the families, slowly extracting yourself from the criminal operations. "What if you could be free?" He looked at me like I'd suggested we fly to the moon, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "That's a fantasy, Arya. The other families wouldn't allow it. They'd see withdrawal as weakness, an opportunity to seize territory and power. And the men who work the gray operations, they need those jobs, that income. We can't just shut down overnight without destroying lives." "I'm not talking about overnight," I countered, warming to the idea as I articulated it. "I'm talking about a 5-year plan, maybe 10. Strategic reduction of risky operations, expansion of legitimate business, careful negotiation with other families about territory transfers." "You're brilliant, Dante. If anyone could engineer a transition like that, it's you." I saw the moment the idea took root in his mind, saw him begin calculating possibilities and obstacles, applying that strategic intelligence to a problem he'd probably never considered solvable before. "It would take resources," he said slowly. "Money to invest in legitimate expansion, leverage to negotiate with other families, trust from the men that I'm not abandoning them. But it might be possible." "Might. Then we start planning," I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Not because I need you to be legitimate, but because you deserve a future that's more than just surviving, more than carrying weight until it crushes you. You deserve to build something instead of just protecting it." That conversation marked a turning point in our relationship, a shift from simply accepting his world to actively trying to reshape it. Dante threw himself into the possibility with the same focused intensity he applied to everything, spending long nights working with Marco and his financial advisors, mapping out strategies for business expansion and operational reduction. I helped where I could, applying my research skills to studying legitimate business models, finding case studies of successful transitions, building spreadsheets and timelines that gave structure to the dream. 2 months after moving into the penthouse, Dante took me to the Moretti family estate in the countryside, a sprawling property that had been in the family for 3 generations, all stone walls and manicured gardens, and the kind of old-world elegance that spoke of roots running deep. His sister Gabriella was there, along with his aunt and uncle, various cousins I'd never met, and the atmosphere was tense in a way that suggested this gathering was more than just a family dinner. "They want to meet you properly," Dante explained as we drove through the gates, his hand tight on my thigh in a gesture that was equal parts possessive and nervous. To assess whether you're suitable, whether you understand what it means to be part of this family. My aunt in particular, she's traditional, believes in arranged marriages within other crime families, thinks I'm making a mistake choosing an outsider. So this is a test. I kept my voice level despite the anxiety churning in my stomach. And if I fail? You won't fail, he said with absolute certainty. But even if they don't approve, even if every single person in that house tells me you're wrong for me, it won't change anything. You're mine, Arya. That's already decided. This is just courtesy. Tradition. Showing them the respect of introducing the woman I'm going to marry before I put a ring on your finger. The dinner was exactly as uncomfortable as I'd anticipated, a formal affair with too many forks and thinly veiled interrogations disguised as polite conversation. Dante's aunt, a severe woman in her 60s who'd married into the family from another crime dynasty, peppered me with questions about my background, my education, my family's lack of connection to their world. I answered honestly, refusing to pretend to be something I wasn't, and watched her disapproval grow with each response that proved how little I belonged in their world. You have no understanding of our traditions, she said finally, setting down her wine glass with enough force to make crystal ring against wood. No appreciation for the sacrifices required, the dangers inherent, the absolute loyalty demanded. Dante needs a partner who understands strength, who comes from strength, who can stand beside him without being a liability. Aunt Maria, Dante's voice was cold, dangerous, and I felt him tense beside me. You're out of line. But I put my hand on his arm, stilling his anger, and met his aunt's gaze steadily. You're right that I don't come from your world, I said quietly. I can't claim generations of family legacy or connections to other powerful families. But I understand sacrifice. My parents gave up everything they knew to give me opportunities in a new country. I understand danger. I've had my life threatened, my home invaded, faced gunfire in the street. And I understand loyalty. I chose to stay with Dante, knowing exactly what that choice meant, knowing the risks, accepting the darkness along with the light. You want someone strong enough to stand beside him? I'm here. I'm not running. And I'll face whatever comes with him, not because I was raised for this, but because I choose it. The silence that followed was deafening, and I wasn't sure if I'd won or lost until Gabriella started clapping slowly, a smile spreading across her face. I like her, she announced to the table. She's got spine. More importantly, Dante's different with her. Softer but somehow stronger, like he's finally got something worth protecting instead of just obligations to fulfill. That's worth more than family connections. His aunt didn't agree, but the rest of the family seemed to warm to me after that, and by the end of the evening I'd survived the gauntlet with at least some degree of acceptance. Dante was quiet on the drive back to the city, and when I asked if I'd embarrassed him, he pulled the car over and kissed me until I couldn't breathe. You were perfect, he said when we finally broke apart. Exactly yourself, no apologies, no compromises. You stood up to Maria, which almost no one has the courage to do, and you did it without disrespecting her or our traditions. I've never been prouder of anyone in my life. The praise warmed me more than it should have, but I'd learned that Dante was sparing with compliments, making each one more valuable for its rarity. Your aunt hates me, I pointed out, trying to inject some levity into the moment. She'll get over it, he said dismissively. Or she won't. Either way, you're mine, and that's not changing. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small velvet box, and my heart stopped. I was going to wait, do this properly with flowers and romance and a perfect proposal. But I can't wait anymore, Arya. I need you to know that you're not just living with me temporarily, not just the woman I'm sleeping with until I get bored. You're my future, my partner, my equal in every way that matters. He opened the box to reveal a ring that took my breath away, a deep red ruby surrounded by diamonds, antique and obviously valuable, the kind of ring that came with history and weight and meaning. This was my grandmother's, Dante said softly. She gave it to my father on his deathbed, told him to save it for someone worthy, someone strong enough to handle our family's legacy. I think she'd approve of you. Dante. My voice broke on his name, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering, what he was asking. Marry me, he said, and it was both command and plea, demand and request. Not because you have to, not because you're trapped in my world with no way out, but because you want this life with me. Because you choose me the way I choose you. Say yes, Arya. Make me the luckiest bastard in this city. I should have asked for time to think, should have considered the implications more carefully, should have been practical and cautious and smart. Instead, I threw my arms around his neck and whispered, "Yes," against his mouth, and felt him slide the ring onto my finger with hands that trembled slightly, betraying the vulnerability he'd tried to hide. It fit perfectly, the weight of it both foreign and right, and when I looked at it in the dim light of the car, it glinted like captured blood, like a promise sealed in something more binding than words. The engagement changed things in subtle ways I hadn't anticipated. Dante became more possessive, more openly affectionate in public, staking his claim in a way that made his world sit up and take notice. I was introduced to business associates not as his girlfriend, but as his fiancée, the future Mrs. Moretti, and I watched men who dismissed me before reassess and adjust their behavior accordingly. It was intoxicating and slightly terrifying, this power I'd acquired by proximity, this respect I'd earned simply by being chosen by someone feared and respected in equal measure. But the engagement also made me a bigger target, something I learned 3 weeks later when I was leaving campus after a late afternoon lecture. I'd gotten careless, used to Victor's constant presence, but also chafing against the loss of privacy, and I'd convinced him to wait in the car while I ran into my office to grab some books. It was a 10-minute errand, nothing that should have been dangerous in broad daylight on a university campus. But when I came back out carrying a stack of papers, someone grabbed me from behind and pressed a cloth over my mouth and nose. The chemical smell was the last thing I remembered before darkness swallowed me whole. I woke to pain, my head pounding and my arms bound behind me, and it took several disorienting moments to process my surroundings. A warehouse, empty except for some wooden crates and industrial equipment, cold and dark and smelling of rust and old violence. A man stood in front of me, late 40s, expensive suit, watching me with the cold calculation of someone assessing merchandise. "Dr. Sinclair," he said, and his voice was cultured, educated, completely at odds with the kidnapping and captivity. I apologize for the crude methods, but Dante Moretti doesn't respond to subtle overtures. Sometimes you need to take something he values to get his attention. Fear clawed at my throat, but I forced it down, forced myself to think clearly despite the drugs still fogging my mind. "He'll kill you for this," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You know that, right? Whatever you think you'll gain by taking me, it's not worth what he'll do to you when he finds me." The man smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. Oh, I'm counting on his reaction. You see, Dante has gotten too comfortable, too confident in his power. He needs to be reminded that he's not invincible, that his empire can be challenged. And what better way to do that than to take his greatest weakness, you? Castellano, I guessed, remembering Sarah's story, remembering Dante's contempt when he'd mentioned the family. "You're using me to start a war." "I'm using you to end one," he corrected. Dante's been expanding too aggressively, absorbing too much territory, making too many demands. The other families are tired of his dominance, ready for new leadership. You're going to be the catalyst for change. Either he backs down and accepts a reduced position, or he watches you die and learns that there are consequences for overreach. The casual way he discussed my death made ice form in my veins, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing my fear. "You've miscalculated," I told him, and something in my certainty made him pause. Dante doesn't negotiate when someone threatens what's his. He doesn't back down or compromise or accept reduced anything. He destroys threats completely, methodically, until there's nothing left to challenge him. Killing me won't make him weak, it'll make him unstoppable. Castellano's expression flickered with something that might have been doubt, but before he could respond, an explosion rocked the warehouse, blowing out windows and sending debris raining down around us. I heard gunfire, systematic and controlled, getting closer, and then Victor appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel, weapon raised, flanked by a dozen of Dante's men. "Step away from her," Victor said, his voice flat and deadly, and I'd never been so grateful to see anyone in my life. Castellano reached for a weapon, but he was too slow. Victor shot him in the shoulder, precise and controlled, dropping him without killing him, and I understood that keeping him alive was deliberate, that Dante would want to handle this personally. They cut my bonds and Victor lifted me like I weighed nothing, carrying me out of the warehouse and into the night air that tasted like freedom and smoke. A car waited, engine running, and Victor deposited me in the back seat where Dante materialized beside me, pulling me into his arms with a force that suggested he'd been barely holding himself together. "I'm okay," I murmured against his chest, feeling the rapid hammer of his heart, the tremor in his hands as they moved over me checking for injuries. "I'm okay, Dante. Victor found me before anything happened." 6 hours, he said, and his voice was raw, broken in a way I'd never heard before. 6 hours of not knowing where you were, if you were alive, what they were doing to you. 6 hours of imagining every terrible possibility, of preparing to burn this entire city down if they'd hurt you. He pulled back enough to frame my face with his hands, and I saw tears tracking down his cheeks, unashamed and devastating. "I can't lose you, Arya. I can't survive losing you. You've become the only thing keeping me human, the only reason I want to be better instead of just being what everyone expects." I kissed him, soft and gentle, a promise and a reassurance. "I'm here. I'm safe. And I'm not going anywhere." But even as I said it, I understood that this was the reality of our life together. Constant threats, perpetual danger, the knowledge that someone would always try to use me against him because I was his greatest weakness and his greatest strength in equal measure. The aftermath of the kidnapping was brutal and swift. Dante turned Castellano over to Marco for interrogation, and whatever they learned from him led to a systematic dismantling of the Castellano family's operations over the next 72 hours. I didn't ask for details, didn't want to know the specifics of what had been done, but I saw the results. Businesses shut down, territory redistributed, men who'd been loyal to the Castellanos switching allegiance to the Morettis with the kind of speed that suggested they'd been waiting for an opportunity. "The other families are reaching out," Dante told me a week later as we sat in the penthouse, him working through paperwork while I graded papers, a domestic scene at odds with the violence surrounding it. Wanting to assure me of their non-involvement, to re-establish boundaries and agreements. "What happened to you? It crossed a line. Even in our world, there are rules about civilians, about family. Castellano violated those rules, and his removal has actually strengthened my position rather than weakening it." I set down my pen and moved to where he sat, perching on the edge of his desk. I had a lot of time to think while I was tied up in that warehouse. I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, about what I want, what kind of life I'm building with you, what I can accept and what I can't. And I realized something important. He looked up from his papers, giving me his full attention, and I saw wariness in his eyes as though he was bracing for bad news, for me to finally reach my breaking point and walk away. "What did you realize?" "That I'm stronger than I thought," I told him. "That I can survive in your world, handle the danger, accept the violence as a necessary part of protecting something worth having. But also that I can't just be the woman standing beside you, the weakness enemies exploit, the reason you have to compromise your strategy. If I'm going to be yours, if we're going to build this life together, then I need to be an active part of it. Not involved in the criminal operations," I added quickly, seeing alarm flash across his face. "But involved in the legitimate businesses, in the community work, in building the future we talked about. Give me something to do besides worry and wait." Relief flooded his features, followed by something that looked like pride. "I was hoping you'd say something like that. Marco and I have been working on expanding the legitimate import business, and we need someone with your intelligence and research skills to analyze markets, identify opportunities, build strategic partnerships. It's real work, challenging work, and it would give you a role in the family business that has nothing to do with violence." The offer was unexpected and perfect, exactly what I needed to feel useful instead of just protected. "I accept," I said, and watched a smile transform his face into something younger, lighter, less burdened. "But I have a condition. We set a wedding date. Soon. I'm tired of being your fiancée. I want to be your wife, want to stand beside you as an equal partner, want the world to know I chose this life with eyes wide open." Dante pulled me into his lap, and his kiss was deep and possessive and full of promises. 3 months, he said against my lips. 3 months to plan something worthy of you, to make sure security is airtight, to show the city that the Moretti family is stronger than ever. Can you wait 3 months to be mine completely? I'm already yours, I reminded him, but I nodded agreement. 3 months. And then you make me Mrs. Moretti, and we start building that future together. The next 3 months were a whirlwind of wedding planning and business development, of learning the legitimate side of the Moretti empire, while carefully avoiding the darker operations. I threw myself into the work with the same focus I'd applied to my doctorate, analyzing import markets and consumer trends, building relationships with suppliers and distributors, finding opportunities for expansion that had nothing to do with gray markets or criminal activity. It was challenging and satisfying in ways my academic work had never been, and I discovered I had a talent for business strategy that surprised even me. Dante watched my transformation with obvious satisfaction, seeing me grow from the heartbroken woman at a concert into someone confident and capable, a partner rather than just a protected asset. We worked together in the evenings, him handling the complex politics of his organization while I built spreadsheets and market analyses. And there was something intimate about the parallel work, about building different aspects of the same empire side by side. The wedding was held at the family estate, a massive affair that managed to be both elegant and slightly intimidating, attended by hundreds of people from both legitimate business circles and the darker world Dante inhabited. I wore a custom gown that made me feel like a queen, all silk and lace and intricate beadwork, with my grandmother's ruby glinting on my finger beside the wedding band Dante would add today. Sarah stood as my maid of honor, loyal despite everything she'd been through, and I saw tears in her eyes as I walked down the aisle toward the man who'd become my entire world. Dante looked devastating in his tuxedo, all sharp lines and barely contained emotion. And when I reached him, he took my hands with a gentleness that contradicted his reputation. The ceremony was traditional, Italian and English mixed together, vows spoken in both languages to honor his heritage and my present. When the priest declared us married and Dante kissed me, I heard applause and cheers, but mostly I felt the weight of commitment settling over us like a blessing, sealing the choice we'd both made to build something beautiful in the middle of darkness. The reception was a blur of toasts and dancing and carefully maintained political alliances, but the moment I remembered most clearly came later, when Dante pulled me onto the dance floor for the final song. We moved together in the dimly lit space, other couples swaying around us, and he held me close enough that I could feel his heartbeat against my chest. "No regrets?" he asked softly, his lips brushing my temple. "No second thoughts about the life you chose, the darkness you married into?" I tilted my head back to meet his eyes, and I saw vulnerability there despite the power and confidence he projected to everyone else. "Only one regret," I said, and watched wariness creep into his expression. "That I didn't meet you sooner. That I wasted time trying to be someone I wasn't for someone who didn't deserve me. But standing alone at that concert, having you demand I pretend to be yours, that was the moment my real life started. Everything before that was just preparation for this." His arms tightened around me, and I felt him press a kiss to my hair, breathing in the scent of me like he was memorizing this moment. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me," he promised. "Building that future we planned, protecting what we've created, showing you every day that you're the best choice I ever made. We're going to build something extraordinary," I told him, absolute certainty in my voice. "Not just a criminal empire or a legitimate business, but a life worth living. A partnership worth fighting for. A love worth all the darkness we had to walk through to find each other." The music swelled around us, violins weeping the same melody that had played the night we met, and I closed my eyes and let myself feel the full weight of this moment. Standing in Dante Moretti's arms as his wife, his partner, his equal, surrounded by the evidence of the empire we'd built together. The danger was still there, the darkness still lurking at the edges, but I'd learned to walk in shadows without losing myself, to love a dangerous man without compromising my strength, to choose this life not because I had to but because I wanted to. When the song ended and Dante led me off the dance floor, I caught Sarah's eye across the room and saw approval there, acceptance of the choice I'd made even if she didn't fully understand it. I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, standing alone at a concert with a broken heart and shattered dreams, and I barely recognized her. That woman had been afraid of taking risks, of stepping into the unknown, of accepting that sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the most rewarding. But I'd learned that love wasn't about safety or certainty or comfortable predictability. Real love was about choosing someone despite their flaws, about accepting darkness along with light, about building something extraordinary in the spaces between who you were and who you wanted to become. And I'd chosen Dante Moretti with my eyes wide open to all his contradictions. The killer and the protector, the criminal and the provider, the dangerous man who looked at me like I was his salvation. We left the reception in a shower of rose petals and well wishes, climbing into a car that would take us to the airport and a honeymoon in Italy, 3 weeks away from the city and the business and the constant threats. As we drove through the night, Dante's hand warm in mine and my wedding band glinting in the passing streetlights, I felt something settle deep in my chest. Peace, maybe, or acceptance, or simply the bone-deep knowledge that I was exactly where I belonged? What are you thinking? Dante asked, watching me with those dark, ancient eyes that had seen so much violence but looked at me with only tenderness. I'm thinking about fate, I said slowly, working through the thought as I spoke. About how Marcus breaking my heart was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it put me in that concert alone, vulnerable, exactly where I needed to be for you to find me. About how one kiss changed everything, opened doors I didn't know existed, led me to a life I never could have imagined. I don't believe in fate, Dante said, but his voice held uncertainty, as though he wanted to be convinced otherwise. I believe in choice, in taking opportunities when they present themselves, in making our own futures rather than accepting what's handed to us. Then let's call it choice, I agreed, lacing my fingers more tightly through his. I chose to help a stranger at a concert. You chose to ask me to dinner instead of just walking away. We chose each other over and over again, through every obstacle and threat and moment of doubt. And I'm going to keep choosing you, Dante Moretti, every single day for the rest of our lives. He pulled me closer, and I felt him press a kiss to my temple, felt the way his breath caught with emotion he'd never learned to properly express. Then we're going to have an extraordinary life, he promised. Because I'm never going to stop choosing you either. You're mine, Aria Moretti. Mine to protect, mine to cherish, mine to build this impossible future with. I smiled against his shoulder, feeling the weight of my new name, the promise it represented, the life it symbolized. Mrs. Moretti, partner to a dangerous man, builder of empires, woman who'd stood alone at a concert 6 months. Thank you so much for watching this story. Please subscribe to my channel for more heartfelt and emotional stories like this one. Don't forget to like this video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. Your support truly means the world and helps me create even more amazing content for you. Make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. See you in the next video.